Hi, my name is Neil Watkins and I run the Think IT ICT Procurement Framework for Education. This is the presentation that I gave at the Academies Show in November, and it talks about the problems that are facing schools and academies in particular, and some of the partners and products that can help overcome those problems. I run something called Think IT, an EU tendered procurement framework for schools ICT led by one of the local authority-backed regional broadband consortia. And as such, it's one of the routes that DFE recommend you consider in their guidance, ICT buying advice for your school. That means that every year I get to talk to hundreds of schools, including individual academies, academy chains, multi-academy trusts, and importantly, schools thinking of becoming academies. We get to hear the glads and sads, the glads of what's working well, new approaches and new innovations, but also the sads of what's not working so well, the big challenges and issues facing school leaders today. I've condensed down all of those hundreds of conversations into three areas, what I call my three big financial Ps: problems and partners and products that can help you deal with those problems in practical and easy ways. So, starting with problems, the biggest and most frequently cited challenge, of course, is money. We heard at the Academies Show from Tom Clark about the perfect financial storm of rising costs, with an additional 700,000 primary school places required by 2020, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying that there'll be an 8% reduction in real terms per pupil spend over the same period. And even though in the autumn budget announcement the Chancellor made announcements on school funding formula, there's no doubt that many school leaders are feeling that budgets are being squeezed, if not cut directly. There's been lots of talk in the press about the need to create efficiencies in schools, and the majority of people agree with that, but the disagreement comes in the how. I've read a number of articles focusing on the so-called discretionary spend that is not staff-related, but in my view, that's not realistic in the long term. If 80% of your organisation's spend is staff costs, then inevitably you'll have no choice but to turn your attention there. And indeed, in a recent ASCL survey, it showed that 55% of heads are expecting to cut staff in the next 12 months. And if you're going to make cuts anywhere, you of course need accurate and up-to-date information in order to make the right decisions. Another big area that we see is obviously ICT. ICT is a contentious issue in the sector with lots of different views. At one end of the spectrum, there are some senior leaders who embrace technology as a vehicle to improve teaching and learning and the effective and efficient running of their schools. But at the other end, there are those who see it as disruptive, ineffective, and expensive. Wherever you stand, there's no doubt that technology is here to stay in education, and there are no good or outstanding schools that I know of that don't use technology to a greater or lesser degree. And if you're going to use IT, then you're going to have to buy it. And procurement's a significant problem for many schools. For example, when I ask the vast majority of head teachers what their ICT strategy for the next 3 years is, and how does that strategy influence their finance and investment decisions, they can't answer the question because they don't have a strategy. And that's a problem because without a strategy, you can only ever make reactive investment and procurement decisions. I therefore think there are three key challenges that need to be addressed about procurement, and they are responsibilities, awareness, and skills. The first procurement challenge I mentioned is responsibilities. You need to be aware of your responsibilities when spending public money. Last month, I was at a meeting of heads who were coming out of BSF ICT contracts, and it was clear that some of them were not aware of their procurement responsibilities. As a public body, if you're letting a contract for over £172,500, which a 3-year fully managed ICT service contract for a secondary school almost certainly will be, then you'll need to comply with the European Public Contracts Directive. And regardless of the amount, you're responsible for the appropriate use of public money. There have been an increasing number of high-profile cases in the press of schools' money being spent inappropriately or lost to fraud and theft. Inevitably, as more schools become academies and have more financial freedoms, the number of those cases will increase. And that's not a reflection on the professionalism of schools or their staff, it's just a reflection on human nature. Some people will just not be able to resist the temptation put in front of them, so you as senior leaders need robust tools and processes to guard against that. The second procurement challenge is awareness, and by awareness I mean what's out there and what you should be buying, not least because the pace of change in technology is amazing. Let me give you a couple of simple examples and a problem that I'm sure you can all relate to. The first example of pace of change is iPads. They're everywhere, and because they're everywhere, you think they've been around forever. But they haven't. The first iPad only went on sale on the 28th of May 2010. That means that 5 years ago today, the number of tablet devices in mainstream education was practically zero. Research published by the BBC earlier this year shows that the number of tablet devices will exceed 1 million in English schools within the next year, and that 70% of all primary and secondary schools are already using them. And that's only devices the school have bought. It doesn't include student or parental-owned devices known as Bring Your Own Device or BYOD, another contentious issue. The second pace of change example is applications or apps. It's estimated that new education-related apps are being published globally at a rate of over 4,000 per month. How are you supposed to keep up with what's good and what's current? And the rise of Minecraft shows the rapid impact of gamification can have on learning. The third example is a problem. It is around schools making snap buying decisions. I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of scenario. I was talking to one school recently and they said, we had some money left at the end of the year, so we bought 80 iPads. And I said, that's great, but what are you going to do with them? How are you going to manage them? Are you going to let staff and students take them home or put applications or personal photos on there? Do you have a policy on privacy? How are you going to manage security? And did you know that iPads can seriously affect the bandwidth on your network if they're not configured correctly? Thinking through those things in advance and having the right IT strategy in place will stop you wasting money and enable you to make better informed decisions. Those are just a couple of easy to relate to examples, but how are you as a school supposed to keep up with the pace of change and the latest developments in connectivity, security, wireless networking, e-safeguarding, equipment and infrastructure? I would argue that you can't. The term ICT now covers too vast a subject area. And yes, there are thousands of excellent network managers and ICT technicians in our schools. But with the best will in the world, they can't possibly be experts in all areas of technology required to run an enterprise on the scale of a large school. It's just not possible. And if it were, and they were that good, I'd suggest that you wouldn't be able to afford them for very long. As a school, no matter how good your technical staff, you're going to need some outside advice and expertise in this area in order to stay ahead of pupils, never mind the rapidly changing technology. The third procurement challenge I mentioned is skills. A few weeks ago, I was listening to a heads forum and they said they'd delegate all of their IT procurement responsibility down to their finance or business managers. Or in a number of cases I've come across, they delegate to teachers who just happen to show an aptitude for or an interest in IT. In my experience, a significant number of schools do not have the skills or expertise to get the best out of the procurement opportunity. And let me give you a specific example. If you're a school coming out of a BSF ICT managed service contract and you haven't planned it 2 years to 18 months out, you're going to struggle. For a number of schools I've talked to recently, either because they've left it too late or because they don't know what's new and what's available, they've specified the same or a very similar service to the one they've had before. And they've done that because they don't know what to ask for, because they don't know what they could have. And what was available 5 years ago when they first signed those contracts is very different to what's available today. They also don't take into account the hidden costs of time, the time it takes to create a good specification, to go out to tender, evaluate and sift responses, negotiate good contracts, then implement effectively so there's no downtime or interruption to the running of the school. A good tender starts with a good specification. We always recommend something called a readiness assessment that starts with a visioning session with your senior leadership team that looks at the outcomes that you want for your pupils, for your staff, your parents and your governors. If you start from the perspective, what are the outcomes we want, you end up making very different technological choices. For example, if literacy in Year 7 is the biggest issue in your school, then buying those 80 iPads might not be the right decision. You might be better off buying new content or applications that children can access at home and involves their parents in their children's reading. Indeed, you might be better off spending that money on CPD for your staff. But if you know the outcomes that you want and you know what your ICT strategy is to achieve those outcomes, you'll inevitably make better financial ICT decisions. But perhaps the most problematic of all the issues I've just mentioned is poor evaluation. Governors, teachers and business managers often don't have the necessary skills or expertise to evaluate proposals running to hundreds of pages, so they make massive financial decisions worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, decisions that will affect the running of the school for the next 3, 4 or 5 years based on half-hour presentations with 10 minutes of Q&A by 4 suppliers. And I don't think that's right. I believe there has to be a better way. So if those are some of the problems, what are some of the solutions? I mentioned right at the start that partners and products can help. Let me touch on the first of those, partners. My impression is that many schools are often reluctant to seek outside advice, especially from private sector organisations, not least because you are, rightly in some cases, worried about being ripped off. In which case, I would offer 3 pieces of advice. The first thing is something that many of you do already, but not all, and that is talk to other schools. However, I've found a reluctance for you to talk to schools close by because you're in competition with them for pupils, or you don't want to expose your problems. If that's the case, you need to cast your net wider, because even though every school is unique, if you've got a challenge, then I can guarantee that someone somewhere will have encountered it before and can offer advice, even if it's only on what doesn't work. The second piece of advice is talk to suppliers. They don't bite, honestly. And I mean talk, not just look them up on Google or Twitter or Facebook. I mean face-to-face, the old-fashioned way. But there's a simple piece of human psychology that gets in the way of you doing this, and it's this. People like to buy. People like to buy, but they don't like to be sold. And they don't like to be sold because they worry about getting ripped off. I get it. Despite rumours to the contrary, I'm human too. But only by talking to suppliers will you turn them into partners and find people who you can trust. Spending time talking to suppliers probably sounds too onerous or difficult because you're all busy people. But when things go wrong, which they always will with IT, you want to know you can pick up the phone and get it sorted. Let me give you a very recent example of a school that switched to the Think IT service. Because of some overnight changes to the Janet network, 2 weeks ago, the head arrived at the school at 07:30 to find the system down, just as the first Ofsted inspector arrived in the car park. But because of his relationship with Think IT, he was able to make one call outside of the specified service level hours, and the service was back up and running by 8:15 before most people, including Ofsted, even knew there was a problem. I give you that example because there are too many stories in the sector of schools being told by their suppliers, "That's not my problem, that's not in the contract, or that'll cost you extra." Again, that can't be right. There has to be a better way. And there are literally thousands of companies out there who might be able to help, but you, and if not you, then your receptionist, probably feels under siege from telephone calls, soliciting emails and junk mail. Because you're now in control of your own budgets, many suppliers feel like it's open season on schools, and you, understandably, put up the barriers. However, there are some ways in which you can engage with suppliers effectively. For example, I know of some schools that have banded together to create their own mini trade events. Run after school, they get a bunch of suppliers in a school hall and run speed dating on specific issues they're facing. And by the way, if you've got a clear ICT strategy and know what you want to buy in advance, this approach is particularly effective. As is using framework, which leads me on to the third piece of advice when it comes to finding the right partners, and that's get professional help. And there's lots of professional help which is free if you know where to look. For example, there are professional bodies like CIPFA, the Chartered Institute for Public Finance and Accountancy. They've been working with the National Association of School Business Managers on creating a set of procurement and finance standards, and are working with ASCL on strategic financial management for schools. Other good advice comes from the Department for Education, as you'd expect. For example, their guidance on buying ICT that I mentioned earlier. In there it talks about procurement frameworks that can help schools, not just from DFE, but from other public sector bodies, such as regional broadband consortia that many of you already use for your connectivity. There are a number of such frameworks out there, and Think IT is just one. I happen to think it's the best, but then I would say that, wouldn't I? I think it's the best because of its scope and its flexibility. It's like a department store for all of a school's ICT. And it's like a department store because it has over 30 of the best educational supplies in 18 different categories, all under one roof. And you just cherry pick the bits that you want and need. It covers everything from connectivity to classroom management, e-safety to safeguarding, and mobile device management to equipment. We can even get you preferential leasing rates so that you can finance your ICT improvements at the same time as balancing your budgets. When I showed this slide to one head, he said for the first time he realised why he'd never been able to fully understand his school's ICT, because there were so many moving parts that he had to think about, and that for the first time all of his school's ICT was on one page. And part of the beauty of the framework is that you only pay for what you want and need. It's all wrapped into one simple to administer contract, and it saves you time and money with procurement. But don't just take my word for it. All of this leads me on to the third financial P I mentioned at the start, products. Perhaps I should have called this section tools, but to be honest, 2 P's and a T didn't sound as catchy as 3 P's, so 3 P's it is. If you're running a school, you're going to have problems. That's inevitable. It comes with the turf. And yes, you can get help, advice and guidance from partners, but it's a set of tools that you're going to need on a day-to-day basis to help you navigate those problems and be successful. Nowhere is that more true than in relation to a school's finances. If you're going to make big financial commitments, if you're going to make efficiency savings, if you're going to cut headcount, which many of you will have to do, you need the most accurate and up-to-date information to make sensible decisions. You've all heard of Sage, I'm sure. They're one of the largest suppliers of accountancy software in the world with over 6 million customers. And that scale and pedigree brings reliability and confidence. They've been around for a long time, and they're going to be around for a long time to come, but what many people don't know is that Sage are one of the biggest suppliers of financial software to the education sector in the UK, with over 3,500 schools and colleges. And I'm sure that number will grow because of the flexibility and scalability of their Sage Line 50 and Sage 200 products. Makes them perfect for managing everything from individual schools right the way up to multi-academy trusts. The biggest Sage reseller in the country is the Technology Services Group, TSG, and they've done something which I think is really clever. They've created a simple-to-use, web-based interface that allows you to get up-to-date, accurate finance data anytime, anywhere, and on any device. That means you can approve invoices and purchase requisitions quickly, cut down on paperwork, save time and speed up the process of getting the things you need to run your school effectively. You can also make the data available to the relevant budget holders and governors to speed up decision making with reports such as spend versus budget, management accounts and governor reports. Importantly, it also helps to de-risk your financial management. It means you're not dependent on just 1 or 2 individuals that could go sick, make mistakes, or even worse. With Sage and TSG financial tools, you can implement sensible checks and balances that show you're compliant with all your statutory reporting requirements. I hope the points I've raised resonated with you. If they did, please contact us. But I'll leave you with these final thoughts. Yes, there are some financial challenges ahead, but if you take the time to find the right partners and have the right tools to enable you to make the right choices, then I'm sure you'll be successful and continue the vital role of teaching our children and young people. Thanks for listening.